The Prelude to Catastrophe. June 1942. The German Wehrmacht appeared invincible. To the world looking on, the Soviet Union was a dying giant, gasping for air after the hammer blows of Operation Barbarossa. But for Adolf Hitler, victory was a moving target. He wasn't just looking for a surrender, he was looking for the resources to fuel a 1,000-year empire. The original plan for the 1942 summer offensive, Case Blue, Fall Blau, was designed to seize the oil fields of the Caucasus. Oil was the lifeblood of modern war. Without it, the panzers would stall. But Hitler's eyes began to wander toward a city on the Volga River, a city that bore the name of his greatest rival, Joseph Stalin. It was a decision born of ego over intellect. Stalingrad held strategic value as a transportation hub, certainly, but for Hitler, it became a psychological obsession. He believed that by taking Stalin's city, he would break the Soviet spirit forever. He didn't realize he was marching his finest army into a meat grinder from which there would be no escape. Case Blue in the split of Army Group South. The German High Command, the OKH, warned against splitting their forces. Logistics in the Russian steppe were already a nightmare. Distances were measured not in miles, but in weeks of mechanical wear and tear. Ignoring his generals, Hitler split Army Group South into two: Army Group A, headed for the oil, and Army Group B, headed for Stalingrad. The Sixth Army, led by General Friedrich Paulus, was the spearhead of Army Group B. Paulus was a meticulous staff officer, a man of the map and the pen, not a charismatic frontline commander. He was now tasked with capturing a city that stretched 30 miles along the riverbank. As the Sixth Army advanced, the Luftwaffe began their work. On August 23, 1942, a massive air raid turned the wooden city of Stalingrad into a towering inferno. Thousands of civilians died in hours. The rubble was intended to clear the path for the panzers. Instead, it created the perfect playground for the defender. Not a step back. In Moscow, Stalin's reaction was cold and desperate. He knew that if the Volga fell, the Soviet heartland would be severed from its southern resources. On July 28, 1942, he issued the infamous Order No. 227, Ni Shagun Nazad, not a step back. This wasn't just a slogan, it was a legal mandate. Blocking detachments were positioned behind Soviet lines to shoot any soldier who retreated without authorization. For the Red Army soldier, the choice was simple: die in the ruins of Stalingrad fighting the Germans, or die at the hands of your own comrades for cowardice. The stage was set. The 62nd Soviet Army, under General Vasily Choykov, was pushed back to the very edge of the Volga. They were fighting with their backs to the water. There was nowhere left to run. The War of the Rats. When the Sixth Army entered the city, the Blitzkrieg died. Tanks, the pride of the German army, became liabilities in the narrow, rubble-choked streets. The battle devolved into what the Germans called Rattenkrieg, the War of the Rats. Combat was no longer measured in kilometers, but in floors of buildings. A factory would be German in the morning, Soviet by noon, and a charnel house by night. Soldiers fought with knives, sharpened spades, and submachine guns in basements and sewers. The industrial zones, the Red October Steel Works, the Barricadi gun factory, and the tractor plant became fortresses. Every pile of bricks held a hidden Soviet sniper. Here, the legendary Vasily Zaitsev began his grim tally, picking off German officers from the shadows. The psychological toll on the Germans was immense. They were the masters of Europe, yet they were being bled white by subhumans in a pile of burning dust. The geography of hell. Pavlov's house. Perhaps no single location epitomizes the stubbornness of the defense like Pavlov's house. Sergeant Yakov Pavlov and a small platoon seized a 4-story apartment building that overlooked a key square. For 60 days, this handful of men held out against constant German infantry and tank assaults. They mined the approaches and used the cellars to move between positions. General Choikov would later joke that the Germans lost more men trying to take Pavlov's house than they did taking Paris. It was a microcosm of the entire battle. German technical superiority, blunted by sheer, suicidal Russian defiance.
The logistics of the Volga. The 62nd Army lived and died by the Volga River. Every night, small boats braved German artillery and Luftwaffe strafing to bring across reinforcements, ammunition, and bread. The wounded were ferried back. General Chuikov's command post was often only a few hundred yards from the front line. He famously kept his headquarters in the city, refusing to cross back to the safe eastern bank. "There is no land for us beyond the Volga," the soldiers sang. This wasn't just propaganda, it was the literal truth. If they lost the riverbank, they lost the war. Hitler's overconfidence and the Romanian flanks. By October, Paulus's 6th Army had captured 90% of the city. Hitler was so confident of victory that he began withdrawing elite units to other sectors. To protect the long, exposed flanks of the 6th Army, the Germans relied on their allies, the 3rd and 4th Romanian armies, the 8th Italian Army, and the 2nd Hungarian Army. These troops were poorly equipped, lacked anti-tank weapons, and had low morale. They were essentially placeholder armies. The German High Command assumed the Soviets were exhausted, incapable of a large-scale counteroffensive. They were wrong. While the 6th Army was obsessed with the final few blocks of Stalingrad, the Soviet Stavka, High Command, was quietly massing 1 million men, 1,500 tanks, and 2,500 aircraft in the steppes to the north and south. Operation Uranus. The trap is sprung. November 19, 1942. A thick fog blanketed the steppe. At 0500, the silence was shattered by the roar of 3,500 Soviet guns and Katyusha Stalin organs. This was Operation Uranus. The Soviet objective wasn't the 6th Army in the city, it was the weak Romanian flanks. The Romanian lines disintegrated almost instantly. From the north and south, Soviet tank corps raced toward each other. On November 23, the two arms of the Soviet pincer met at the Kalach Bridge. In just 4 days, the 6th Army, roughly 250,000 to 300,000 men, was completely encircled. The hunters had become the prey. The hubris of the Luftwaffe. When Paulus realized he was surrounded, he requested permission to break out. A swift retreat might have saved the army, but Hitler, bolstered by the empty promises of Luftwaffe chief Hermann Goering, forbade it. Goering boasted that his air force could fly 500 tons of supplies daily to the fortress Stalingrad. It was a lie. The Luftwaffe never came close, averaging less than 100 tons. The planes were harassed by Soviet fighters and the brutal winter weather. Soldiers who expected food and ammunition instead received shipments of luxury items, thousands of sets of condoms, pepper, and summer uniforms. The 6th Army was starving. To reach the 8,000 mark, we must transition from a broad summary to a minute-by-minute analytical deep dive. The following chapters, 9 through 20, focus on the tactical decay, the psychological collapse of the German command, and the horrific aftermath. The Airbridge fantasy and Goering's failure. When the Kessel was closed on November 23, 1942, General Paulus faced a choice: defy Hitler and break out, or wait for rescue. Hitler, residing in his wolf's lair in East Prussia, was buoyed by the bravado of Reichsmarschall Hermann Goering. Goering, a man increasingly detached from reality, promised that the Luftwaffe could deliver 500 tons of supplies daily to the 6th Army. It was a mathematical impossibility. To deliver 500 tons, the Luftwaffe needed favorable weather, functional airfields, and a fleet of transports that simply didn't exist in the East. The reality was a nightmare. On average, only 94 tons reached the city per day. Instead of flour and bullets, planes often dropped useless crates of marjoram, pepper, and, in one of the most insulting logistical errors in history, thousands of sets of condoms. The Sixth Army was starving. Operation Winter Storm, the last gasp. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, perhaps the most brilliant tactician in the Wehrmacht, was tasked with the impossible, Operation Wintergewitter, Winter Storm. On December 12th, he launched a relief strike from the south with the 4th Panzer Army. For a few days, hope flickered in the frozen ruins of Stalingrad. The panzers fought their way to within 30 miles of the Sixth Army's perimeter. Paulus could see the flashes of Manstein's guns on the horizon, but there was a catch. Hitler strictly forbade Paulus from moving the Sixth Army towards Manstein. Hitler insisted that Paulus hold every inch of the Volga riverbank. Paulus, ever the obedient staff officer, refused to break out without a direct order. The thunderclap order never came. While Paulus waited for permission, the Soviets launched Operation Little Saturn, threatening to cut off Manstein's own lines of communication. Manstein was forced to retreat. The Sixth Army was left to its fate. The last door had slammed shut.
The hunger and the cold. By late December, the temperature plummeted to -30 degrees Celsius. The German soldiers were still wearing the same summer and autumn tunics they had worn in July. Stalingrad leg, a horrific combination of frostbite and gangrene, became more common than combat wounds. The horses of the Sixth Army, once numbering in the thousands, were the first to be eaten. Then came the dogs, then the cats. Finally, there were whispers of the unthinkable, cannibalism. The German soldier, once the pride of the world, was reduced to a skeletal figure wrapped in stolen Soviet women's coats and rags. Typhus began to rip through the bunkers. The Sixth Army was no longer a military force. It was a mass of dying men waiting for a miracle that wasn't coming. The Soviet ultimatum and the final assault. On January 8, 1943, Soviet General Konstantin Rokossovsky offered Paulus generous terms of surrender, food, medical care, and the promise of a return to Germany after the war. Hitler's response was immediate. Surrender is out of the question. The Sixth Army will hold its position to the last man and the last cartridge. On January 10th, the Soviets launched Operation Ring. 7 Soviet armies converged on the pocket. This wasn't the Rattenkrieg of the city streets anymore. This was a mass execution by artillery. The Germans were pushed back into a smaller and smaller circle. One by one, the last 2 airfields, Pitomnik and Gumroch, fell to the Soviets. The Airbridge was gone. There were no more supplies, no more evacuations for the wounded. The Sixth Army was now a ghost in the snow. The promotion, a death sentence in disguise. On January 30th, 1943, the 10th anniversary of Hitler's rise to power, the Führer sent a final message to Paulus. He promoted him to Generalfeldmarschall. It was a cynical move. In the history of the German military, no field marshal had ever been taken alive. The message was clear. Hitler expected Paulus to commit suicide. He wanted a martyr's death to use for propaganda. But Paulus, a devout Catholic who despised suicide, remarked, "I have no intention of shooting myself for this Bohemian corporal." On January 31st, Soviet soldiers entered the basement of the Uniway department store, Paulus's final headquarters. They found the newly minted field marshal lying on a dirty cot, his face twitching from a nervous tic. He surrendered. The bitter end, February 2nd, 1943. 2 days after Paulus surrendered, the final pocket of resistance in the northern industrial sector collapsed. On February 2nd, 1943, the guns of Stalingrad finally went silent. The statistics are staggering. Over 91,000 German prisoners were marched into the frozen steppe. Of those 91,000, only about 5,000 would ever see Germany again. The rest would die in Soviet labor camps of disease, exhaustion, and malnutrition. The Sixth Army, once the most powerful army on Earth, had ceased to exist. The aftermath and the turning tide. The Battle of Stalingrad was the psychological death of the Third Reich. While the war would drag on for 2 more bloody years, the German army never truly recovered its offensive momentum in the East. The myth of German invincibility was shattered. For the Soviet Union, it was the Great Patriotic War's greatest triumph. It proved that they could outmanufacture, outfight, and outlast the Wehrmacht. But the cost was apocalyptic. Over 1.1 million Soviet soldiers and hundreds of thousands of civilians died to hold that city. Hitler's strategic blindness. He had ignored the advice of his quartermasters. He had ignored the intelligence about Soviet reserves. He had, quite simply, believed his own propaganda. Stalingrad was the anvil upon which the Nazi dream of Lebensraum was crushed. The human cost, a city of ghosts. After the battle, Stalingrad was a wasteland of twisted metal and human remains. It took years to clear the unexploded ordnance. To this day, the Mamayev Kurgan, the hill overlooking the city, is filled with the bones of those who fell. In the spring of 1943, the grass on the hill didn't grow because the soil was so saturated with metal and oil. Legacy of the battle. Stalingrad remains the largest, bloodiest battle in human history. It redefined urban warfare. It taught the world the meaning of total war. For Germany, it was the Götterdämmerung, the twilight of the gods. The road to Berlin. From the ruins of the Volga, the Red Army began a relentless march that would only end in the heart of Berlin. The momentum shifted irrevocably. The greatest mistake had been made, and there was no turning back. Conclusion. We remember Stalingrad not just as a map of arrows and troop movements, but as a testament to what happens when absolute power meets absolute hubris. Hitler's mistake wasn't just tactical, it was moral. He underestimated the human will to survive in the face of annihilation.